Welcome everyone this morning. I hope you spent your day with us, and I hope you've been with us all week long. It's been an exciting week. We're in the home stretch of a 4-day program, which has stretched my staff and our capacity. So this is an idea I came up with some time ago. It's driven by two things. One is every morning, no matter where I am, but I read 4 newspapers in the wire service. The 4 are the Financial Times, the Wall Street Journal, the Washington Post, and the New York Times. Religiously, I read them. And when I'm home, I like the print edition. I'm old-fashioned. I like to print. I like to clip usually Martin and Greg's musings, and I put them in little files for reasons when I'll call you later. And Martin and I sometimes have late-night email exchanges. And so I thought, if I'm going to do that this morning, why don't I just invite them to come here and read the papers with me? And so I can't think of a better group of people to start my morning with, because I do it every day. And I thought I'd invite all of you to join us as well. So this is a casual conversation. We've got a cup of coffee. Hope you've had some breakfast. And we're going to run through what's in today's papers. Although, because news moves so quickly, and because we have social media and Twitter and so many other issues, even by the time these papers hit my front doorstep at about 5 a.m. this morning, the world has moved on. So let's start with what is not on the U.S. edition front page, Martin, but is certainly on the U.K. edition and on FT website, and that's in Brexit. Parliament is sitting in a Saturday session, the first time in 37 years. Prime Minister Johnson's got everything on the line. He has a deal in hand, he says. How do you see Brexit playing out today and over the next few days?
Well, the advantage of this just being a conversation is that whatever I say now can be quickly forgotten. Because, of course, I was being asked by many of my friends what I think, and I said, to me, it's a coin toss. So my gut instinct, and this is based on no scientific knowledge beyond what I've just been reading this morning, is that he is probably more likely than not to get this through. But it's going to be very, very close. He also has, or at least that was, as I understand it, and I'm not a parliamentary expert, he has to get legislation through, which means that he needs needs a majority consistently, and needs to get legislation through if he wants to leave on October the 31st. And there is offsetting legislation which would, from Oliver Letwin, which would postpone the vote. Mm-hmm. It's not clear to me yet whether that will go through. And then we, at some stage in this process, even if he gets this through now, we might have to ask the EU for an extension. I assume it will be given if there's been a majority. Right. For his proposals, if they need extra time to go through the subsequent process, which is quite plausible. If he doesn't pass, Parliament is likely to insist that he asks for an extension anyway. The Prime Minister is quite likely not to do that. He might resign. It might lead to a vote of confidence. We could have another government by the end of next week. And the possibilities fan out. But to start off the immediate question, I think it's more likely than not that he will just scrape through with this today. That doesn't resolve everything, or certainly doesn't decide everything, but it makes it more likely, much more likely than not, if that happens, that we will leave soonish on these terms.
But as Churchill said, it's not the beginning of the end, it's the end of the beginning. It really is. Then you have to begin negotiating what does the new relationship look like. Of course. And then, of course, it's what does the U.S.-UK relationship look like? What does the UK-China relationship? But it's not as if resolution is coming. It really is years of uncertainty going forward, at least the weight of the uncertainty of how one leaves.
My view is that essentially it's forever. There will be some big negotiations, and in between there will be surely a general election because we don't have a working majority for any party, and the result of that general election will be very important in determining how it goes. The general assumption is if he gets this through, he will win a working majority. But that's not certain. Our parliamentary arithmetic has got very difficult. But when I say forever, I have sort of think about, this is perhaps a bit extreme, but I know obviously lots of Swiss negotiators, and they will tell you, of course, that they are in permanent negotiation with the EU on everything. Right. Because they're landlocked, the relationship is even more intimate, but essentially it never stops. And my guess is that the same will be true for the UK, because I think the deal we're likely to do under Boris Johnson, which we call Canada minus, which is my not very humble view, insane, will not stick. It won't be adequate. And so we will probably want to restart negotiations. How that will work on the other side, I don't know. And as you rightly said, we will then be involved in really fun negotiations with the US, which I expect to be a total nightmare, and China, which will be a total nightmare squared. So, it is the beginning of a fun time.
Especially if the U.S. takes the perspective, you've got to choose between the U.S. and China. If you're going to have an FTA with U.S., then therefore it will prohibit certain kinds of relationships with China going forward. That's a real challenge.
Well, there is I think of it, I'm afraid it's even more complicated than that, though that's clearly true. We will also face, in very important areas, if we want subsequent negotiations and deals on the basis of quote-unquote equivalence in the financial sector and so forth, we will also face a whole range of issues: data, finance, agricultural regulations, choice between US and EU standards.
Right.
And they will be in the economy, as it were, and it'll be very, very difficult to operate both. So I think that this question of how we manage the attempt to be in, as it were, everybody's regulatory area at the same time is going to turn out to be completely impossible. My guess is in the end we will stick with the EU in most of these areas because it's overwhelmingly our biggest trading partner and will remain so. But who knows, because this is a very ideological commitment, and this government, if it gets a majority, will be very pro-American, or at least pro this America. Well, even that's complicated. So anyway, I think it's as I put it in one column, Brexit is the gift that goes on giving.
We're going to come to trade in a minute, Greg, but speaking of this America, the Times leads today with Trump, 1,000 days in the White House, a presidency remade in Trump's image. The Journal has a piece that says Trump leans on an altered GOP and notes how the composition of the Republican Party has changed over time. Those with a college education have fled the party. Those whites without a college education have been attracted to the party. But let's start, Deborah, with a presidency remade in Trump's image. It is all about him. It is a very different presidency. The institution has probably changed for at least some period of time. How do you see this Trump presidency in 1,000 days?
Well, I think the story today by Peter Baker sort of sums it up, that Trump sees being presidential as boring. And that when he goes to rallies, that if he started to talk about, thank you for coming, I'm thrilled to be here representing you, that people would leave. And so to him, being president is about attracting attention, getting crowds, getting people excited, getting people in line with him. And he uses the television personality that he's honed for so long to do that. Whether it's for good or bad, time will tell. But for right now, it's entertaining, if not keeping a lot of us employed for the foreseeable future. But you do wonder what happens to the fabric of the institution, and there are ramifications to what he does. I mean, we saw the other day Erdogan saying that he did not take the letter from President Trump seriously because it was written in such a non-diplomatic way. It had no finesse, and so I think being non-presidential has real world ramifications that go beyond just kind of rallying your base and getting your base excited and animated for the next election. There are real pitfalls to the way you operate as a president if you don't follow protocol. Now that said, I mean, throwing protocol out the window has been kind of the conventional wisdom for the last few years. I mean, starting with Brexit and then the election of Trump, it seems like there was this undercurrent that we had to change the establishment, throw out what we had because it wasn't working for the working man. But we don't know yet if the way that the president is approaching this presidency is actually going to help or hurt, average Americans. A lot remains up in the air with the trade war. If he does auto tariffs, that's going to be devastating for a lot of blue collar workers. So I think it is entertaining, if nothing else. But I think it also is potentially very troublesome.
To your point, it broke with tradition on style and protocol, as you note. Said he could do a better deal on NAFTA, on North Korea, on Iran, and on China. Greg, is the U.S., is the president making progress on Iran, on Syria, on North Korea, on China? Is it for the working? Is the working man getting something out of this presidency?
It depends on how you define progress. Not the kind of progress people up here would probably typically want to see, I suppose. No. I think that stepping back for a moment, the president had a couple of assumptions about his trade agenda that have proven not to be true. I think the first assumption was if you put up tariffs, that will reshore production, it'll help American manufacturing. That has not happened. Global supply chains are just too intimately connected. I think his second assumption was that nobody would retaliate because they need us more than we need them. That has also proven to be wrong. The Canadians retaliated, the Mexicans retaliated, the Europeans retaliated, and the Chinese definitely retaliated. And so what he thought would be a positive sum game would be a zero-sum game with the U.S. winning and them losing has turned out to be negative sum with both sides losing. So over the last year, if we focus, we've essentially the conflicts with traditional partners, Mexico, Canada, and Europe are kind of now sort of on the back burner. We'll get to Europe in a second. Mm-hmm. But the China one obviously is the big elephant in the big trade elephant in the room. What we've learned over the last year is that there are actually limits to how far the president can go on that, and the fact that he settled for the mini deal, if you could even call it that, in the last week or two, shows that he's sensitive that ratcheting the pressure up even further has real economic and financial market consequences for the United States and by extension for his re-election. So he's kind of tapped out on that. But the failure to make any meaningful progress, the fact that the Chinese walked away in April or May, and that the mini deal consists of simply not ratcheting pressure up further, also tells us how much further the two sides have gotten apart. When the president started down this route with China, he had relatively narrowly defined transactional goals. He wanted a narrower bilateral trade deficit, a few changes to the way the Chinese treated American companies with respect to things like intellectual property. And what has happened is that this basically has brought out of the woodwork a lot of constituencies in American life who have deep structural grievances with the way China runs itself. Mm-hmm. I like to say that there are basically three sets of China hawks in this country. There's national security hawks who don't trust it geopolitically, economic hawks who don't like the way China treats other companies, and human rights hawks who don't like the fact that this is a society, that this is a country that essentially suppresses democracy and dissent. And all three, they are now on the same page, they're now all unified, and they have not perhaps by any overarching design, managed to drive a widening wedge between the two sides. Look at the NBA controversy, right? To me, what was less interesting than the fact that the Chinese retaliated against the NBA for a politically controversial tweet, it was the blowback the NBA got here domestically, across the spectrum. Three of the Democratic presidential candidates speaking out against it, Ted Cruz, Marco Rubio, Josh Hawley on the Republican side. So what that tells me is the two sides are much further apart than ever before. In my view, we have gone from the acute phase of trade war with China to the chronic phase, where it no longer is a threat to the near-term economic outlook, but is going to be a permanent feature of the global economy for some time to come.
But the president's principal metric is the trade deficit, and yet it's only gotten larger. So by his own measure, he's losing this war, right?
That's right. Well, what we've seen actually is the U.S.-China trade deficit has narrowed, but the deficit with Vietnam and a few other countries has widened because all we've done is divert imports from those countries to the other countries. So no, by any sort of either his metrics or by even other more broader metrics, he really hasn't achieved much at all on trade.
Let me connect this back with the common man or his constituency, and that is it trade or is it technology that has been most harmful to Middle America? Chapter 2 of the WEO says it is mostly trade. We have other economists who say it is technology. Or I'm sorry, the WEO says it's technology, not trade. Others say it's trade. Martin, you've written tomes, books, articles about globalization. Is globalization the source of American working man's ills?
May I just make, before I make one comment on, because I thought Greg's overview of this was wonderful and but perhaps a little diplomatic. I wrote a column that says that we're at the beginning of a new 100 Years' War, and I believe that very, very strongly. There is one dimension of that relationship that he didn't discuss, but which I've spent a lot of time on, which is how the Chinese see all this. And I think there are two things about their perspective which is very, very important. The first, and I think crucial one, is that they found it almost impossible to work out what the Americans really wanted. And that was partly because when they looked at the negotiating documents and dealt with the negotiators and dealt with the president and saw the political pressure that Greg describes, it wasn't at all clear what the US bottom line is. And in particular, is the US trying to achieve manageable, from their point of view, policy reforms, or is the US trying to stop Chinese development, or is the US trying to decouple completely? And if you don't know what your counterpart's aims are, you can't really negotiate sensibly.
That is
correct. And the second point is that they regarded the whole tone and style of the negotiation as deeply and profoundly humiliating in every way I can go. And Mr. Xi cannot concede to that. He cannot. So one of the most fascinating things to me is what on earth was in the head of the people who started down this track. Well, my own view is nothing. I mean, nothing. So this is not going to be resolved. It is with us forever. Now, on the trade policy, I've just written, I'm in the middle of a book on this, which includes this. I think there is an overwhelming consensus among professional economists who are experts and therefore worthless, summarized in a wonderful book by Alan Helpman, very distinguished professor in Harvard, that if you look at the overall situation in terms of rising inequality, employment, and so forth, of working people, globalization, while a factor, unquestionably a factor, was a relatively unimportant factor relative to technology, but also changes in the way corporations worked, which is related, I think, to what Jamie Dimon talked about yesterday. So a whole shift in the paradigm. And so those of us who followed this debate closely for decades are terrified, and this applies to Brexit too, that what I think of as the populist right blaming of foreigners for the plight of the working people not only is intellectually wrong, but it could have terrible political consequences, because at some point, God knows when, they'll work out they've been cheated, because it's not going to do anything for them. And what worries me then is these politicians will double up on the xenophobic and, let's be brutal, racist rhetoric, and this can completely destroy our country.
So you think
So I think it's worse just than irrelevant. It could be very, very damaging for our society.
So I'm going to bring Deborah in. So in some ways you're saying there's a misdiagnosis. Politicians have made this about trade and economics, but really there's something more to it than that. In fact, I would argue there's a huge cultural gap between the coastal cosmopolitan urbanites, and I grew up in rural Kentucky. I can assure you it's a very different cultural profile. So Deborah, are we misdiagnosing, and are politicians misdiagnosing the problem, therefore the solutions are wrong? And to Martin's point, will they just double down on the wrong solutions and we just exacerbate this division?
Well, I mean, I think if you look at the economic policy of this president, you'd be hard-pressed to understand exactly what it is, right?
Right.
He did a giant tax cut that rewarded corporations. It was supposed to help return a flood of money to the United States and result in a lot of investment, give workers more, pay. He's living in sort of this mercantilist world, right, where he thinks all of the ills that globalization brought about can be reversed. And as Greg said, he has a zero-sum game in his mind. If anyone else is winning, the United States is losing. Well, you can't operate like that in the 21st century. His tax cut did nothing to incentivize the service industry. Technology, automation is a huge threat. There is I can't think of a single policy that his administration has come out with that's going to help kind of the industries of the future. There are entire approach is defensive. They're trying to stop China from working with American companies to develop things like quantum computing and AI. I mean, they're coming out with this new export controls list that's going to prevent American companies from selling technology overseas, primarily aimed at China. They're trying to prevent Chinese investment in the United States because they think that's somehow disadvantaging the United States workforce. I don't see any policies that are helping average workers prepare for the future. And in the past we had things like trade adjustment assistance, which were supposed to help people deal with the downsides of globalization. We've passed that point. If you've lost your job to globalization and you have not gotten retrained for something that is going to be a job of the future, it's too late. So I think Martin is right that there is going to be this uprising. The coal jobs are not coming back, and if they do come back, it's going to be a blip, right? So I don't really understand what it is that we are trying to do with our economic policy to prepare the United States for the future, other than trying to prevent other countries from leading.
I just want to touch on your original question here, Tim, because for the last 2 or 3 years, there's been a debate about what gave us Trump and other populists. Was it economics or was it cultural? And my Twitter timeline is full of people who think about economics all the time. They're economic imperialists. Of course, they think it was economics. They think it was globalization. They think it was inequality. Because I'm kind of an obnoxious contrarian, I've been disagreeing with them for the last 2 or 3 years. But I would concede that it is some kind of mixture of both. But I think the key thing that I've learned in the last few years is that it's technology and it is automation. But those are not ultimately what drives the polarization and the split. It is how political leaders choose to exploit those fact sets and deploy them and apply them in other different directions. And if you sort of look at the polling data and sort of some of the anecdotal evidence, like Peter brings us back from Dallas at the rally, it's that what seems to where the populists seem to draw their support from is not people who feel that they have suffered because of globalization, but they perceive that their interests are starkly opposed to those of the so-called globalists, right? And by globalism, I don't just mean that they're in favor of free trade. They're in favor of free movement of capital. They're in favor of free movement of people. They are the people who want Britain in the European Union and people to move across borders like that. Brexit was driven primarily not by people who are losing their jobs. The biggest pro-Brexit constituency was retired people who have no sort of work risk at hand if they stay in the EU. It's people who don't like the way globalization and globalism has changed the context and the community that they live in. And what this president has managed to do is to basically realign American politics, which were traditionally driven by left versus right, kind of an economic scale, an economic continuum, to sort of a globalism versus nationalism, or cosmopolitan versus communitarian kind of thing. And that is where elections are now being fought. And so I think that it's a useful exercise for academics and journalists to explore this automation versus globalization issue. But I think in terms of determining outcomes of elections and the kinds of rhetoric that we're going to see, it might be secondary.
If that's the case, then how do politicians manage the cultural evolution? We fall in love with nostalgia, right? Republicans love the 1950s, Democrats like the 1930s and we're not going back. In fact, they weren't so great anyway, if you really look at the facts of the time. So how do they actually produce what they can't produce, which is a previous time, an ideal that wasn't really real, Martin? I mean, they can't produce what they say they're going to produce. So is that back to your point? There's just going to be even more frustration. We're not going back to the 1950s.
Well, political programs that are essentially nostalgic, which are reinforced, and I don't want to go into the details of what Greg said, by an immense amount of rage and resentment of an inchoate kind, have a very bad history, right? We've been there, done that, got the T-shirt, as it were, collectively. Because, and this is the key point, it takes politics out of which is what Deborah was saying, the practical, the feasible. Ultimately, the world has the world works in the way it does, and promising people something that they can't get won't deliver on the ground what is implied. So the logic of this process is to play harder and harder on the very broadly defined cultural aspects of all this. And if we're talking then about how does that get focused? and different countries have different myths, different histories, so they go in different ways at this cultural stuff. In the US, the full range of the cultural wars are beyond the conception of anybody from Europe. I mean, the range of things you can fight about culturally is impressive, so it gets you obviously to guns, capital punishment, abortion, women's rights, transgender rights, immigration, China, because they're really foreign. So xenophobia, racism, this you can have a hell of a culture war, right? And I presume you can keep going at this for a very long time and destroy the Republic, in my view. In Britain, thank heavens, it's a little bit narrower. We just seem to hate Europeans, and who happen to be our most important partners and neighbors. And we wish there weren't any foreigners in the country, and we wish this particularly passionately, which is relevant to Greg's comment, in parts of the country where they feel they've lost their traditional country and have no immigrants. There are no immigrants in these pockets of working class culture where people voted passionately to get rid of all the immigrants. But that's being a bit simplistic. So the problem is, once you're in the domain of cultural conflict and broadly defined in this very broad way about the future of the nation, I understand why we've got there. I've written a lot of chapters on this in my book. I don't know how you turn that into practical politics. So I think you're then on a spiral in which the successor on that side, the successor to Boris, the successor to Donald Trump, is going to double up.
Right.
And I don't see what stops it. So that is why, to me, this is truly terrifying. It just takes politics, it's not really about left, right, out of the zone of the practical into an existential war. And that seems to me what's happening to our societies.
Greg, but what does that mean for economic policy? So let's just go back to Economics 101, the daily blocking, tackling, Washington tax policy, capital gains, wealth tax. So how do you take the economic policy making and the proposals and those who have plans and lots of plans and actually fit it with the cultural war?
Well, I mean, look, to Martin and Greg's point, he said Greg was being too diplomatic. You're never going to solve racism with policy, right? You're never going to solve cultural differences with policy. But I think what you're seeing now, especially in sort of the new wave of Democrats coming forward with these ideas, these policies. There's a piece today in the New York Times about how the old people, we need to get rid of them because they've ruined us. They've ruined everything. They're sucking all the money out of the country and for their own purposes, and they don't want immigrants. They don't want people of color. The demographics of the United States are changing. They have changed. I mean, whites are going to be a minority. I think they already are. And I think you have this new group of younger voters and younger politicians, whether you like them or not. You don't have to be a fan of AOC to understand that she's coming from a place where she sees a country that is changing rapidly, but its policies are not keeping up. And so whether you think a wealth tax is the right way to go, if you think Medicare for all is the right way to go, I mean, there is going to be sort of this, this reckoning of resources. I mean, nobody talks about the deficit anymore. Nobody cares about the deficit.
Right.
But at some point, you're going to see sort of this, you're going to have more people retired than in the workforce, and there's going to be a fight for resources. I think that's why you need policies that are going to protect, folks who are vulnerable from losing out. So people, if student debt is going to continue to be a problem, figuring out a way to help people get college educations without having to sacrifice their entire financial lives, policies that will help deal with inequality. And actually, I saw a piece yesterday that the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act may have actually helped with poverty. So that's great if that did help. Although those tax cuts sunset, so who knows what happens, in 9-8 years from now. But there are policies that can help around the edges, but you're never going to find a policy that's going to help somebody not hate immigrants. You know, although you are seeing, one of my reporters has been going out to Pennsylvania, you are seeing a change in some of these very red places where, unlike in Britain, there are immigrants and they have become incredibly important to the local economy, right? You don't have people who are going to go out and pick in the fields, who are going to package the meat. You know, there is sort of a recognition in some areas, but it's slow, that immigrants are not our enemy. They're actually doing a lot of the work that we need. And at a moment when the unemployment rate is incredibly low and there's seemingly more room in the labor force than, you know, we have than, you know, we don't have enough jobs for all the people who want them. You know, maybe that is what's going to shift the dime a little bit in terms of people realizing that having immigrants in this country is not a negative, it's a positive.
Right.
You had asked what is the economic outcome of populist politics. When I think Trump and all the other populist leaders, whether it was Viktor Orban or Narendra Modi came along, people I think automatically look back to the last instance of a broad populist movement, and that was Latin America in the 70s. And they said, therefore, this will end the same way. That populist movement involved a lot of sort of state intervention, import substitution, autarky, and so forth, and ended with hyperinflation, and economic instability, stagnation, et cetera, et cetera. And I think people have been surprised that that has not been the case. In fact, some of these populist countries like Hungary and Poland have done extremely well. And I would argue that partly it's because the world had not ever actually seen what I would classify Trump and Modi from India as pro-business populists. So I talked a moment ago that we have basically two political axes now in the world. We have the left-right economic axis and the north-south globalist versus nationalist axis. And what that means is that a political party can end up in any of those four quadrants. You can be a populist conservative on you can be a conservative on economics, but a populist on culture, or a liberal on economics and a populist on culture. And people like Bolsonaro and Modi and Trump have generally been in that upper right quadrant. So people thought that Trump was going to bring about an economic disaster because most economists sort of are globalists. You know, they think free trade is good. What they didn't appreciate that there were a lot of other elements to the Trump program that would offset the negatives of that. Now, what I think you're going to see in the next few years is that because the economic outcome of a populist regime is going to essentially be the net result of the things that are bad for growth, like protectionism, and the things that are good for growth, like lower taxes. And you know, what's the delta? How does that balance out? Well, we got a tax cut. You know, we rolled back the more sort of invasive parts of the regulatory regime. It's probably the case that whatever positive effects we were having from that part of Trumpism have been exhausted.
Right.
And now, over the next few years, I think some of the negatives are going to be felt. And then I would look to Narendra Modi and India as kind of the roadmap, because he is kind of the original populist in this whole sort of like global populist movement. What we've seen is that he sort of like said and did a lot of the good things. There was a lot of enthusiasm about the BJP originally because of what he had done at the state level in India, but he has essentially run into exactly the same sort of deep, bureaucratic political resistance to the kinds of reforms that are necessary for India to grow faster. It's experiencing a growth problem and an inflation problem. And because he's a populist first and a pro-business person second, he is now going to that populist well now to sustain his support. Therefore, you see things like the conflict with Kashmir. You can probably anticipate the same thing from this president as well, that in terms of sustaining his popularity and his electoral base, that when it comes to time between choosing things that are good for the economy and good for his populist message, he will probably choose the first. That's why I think that, although I don't expect more trade wars over the next year or two, I don't expect him to suddenly blossom into kind of like a free trader who then starts to implement the sorts of policies that traditional Republicans, traditional economic conservatives would have expected from a Republican.
But there's an institutional angle to this, in the sense that with greater polarization, Congress is dysfunctional, many parliaments around the world are dysfunctional, fiscal policy is also constrained. So we rely on, in the U.S., executive order, which has become very popular, not only this administration previously, but central banks have become our savior. The ECB, the Bank of Japan, the Bank of England, and the Federal Reserve. And we see the Federal Reserve under constant attack from the president. Martin, are we relying on central bankers too much? And are they, I know they complain about it, but are they secretly willing to play the save the world role, and is that a problem?
I'll come to, yeah, very important. Just to again, because it's incredibly important, Greg made a very, very important point, which is because if you look at the Eastern European politics, and this is exactly right, we've got authoritarianism, social conservatism, and the welfare state. And I think that's a fantastically popular combination. And what really fascinates me about the Trump administration is he didn't get behind his own instincts on things like infrastructure and all the rest of it. Because I think he came over as a more liberal person, in your sense, not in economics, than the other candidates. And I think that's why he got the presidency. I think if he governed as a populist liberal, in your terms, he'd have 60% support. I think that if you add to that, which is what Orban and, of course, to a lesser extent, but the polls are doing, and I wouldn't possibly comment on here, really work very hard to fix the electoral system so you can't lose, you're in pretty good shape. So that, I think, is the logical way for the American right to go, and I predict it. The next leader will be like this. On the central banks, I have been arguing now for quite a while that, one, what they did was necessary, what they continue to do was necessary. The efficacy at the margin is very low. And if we get another, obviously, central point, if we stay where we are now, we're just about okay. And if we have, for any reason, because these things happen, a serious recession, nobody really knows the hell what they're going to do. And I think any of the unconventional armory would be completely ineffective in dealing with a serious recession everywhere, even here, but obviously dramatically so in Europe. So the question is, what would they do then? Well, the answer to that, it seems to me pretty clear, is they would need an immense amount of help from the government. I don't think they can do helicopter money without changing the law. And I wouldn't favor that, though I have friends who would. But essentially, I think the next stage of macro policy would have to be, without a doubt, fiscal monetary coordination in a way we haven't seen since the first days of the crisis. I would expect the Europeans to get there far too late. So I'm really worried the next recession we really become Japan in Europe, and that is a very difficult place to get out of. And the other thing I think they should be thinking about, and this comes back to the populism and why our response has been so feeble, is intelligent left-of-center politics, which I don't think we're getting, though we're getting some very interesting ideas, is we should be thinking about the sorts of fiscal policies that would actually start dealing with our structurally deficient demand problem, which I think is evident, and which is, I think, income distribution related in significant part. But I think the central bank will save us playbook is pretty well at the end when Japan, Europe, Britain are basically stuck at zero, or very close to it, and it'll be more so after Brexit. And America, you couldn't get to above 2.5% in this cycle. I think that's the single most interesting thing to me that has happened in the last year. The US, we were confident a year ago that the Fed funds rate would just continue on up, and you couldn't get above 2.5% with a very strong economy. This is really extraordinary. So I think that game is played out.
And we have Larry Summers this afternoon, and he said he's going to do a victory lap because he's been right all these years about secular stagnation.
I did say that 10 years ago.
The deification of central banks, but are they really paper tigers? And to your point, what actually do we do in the next downturn? You and I have had this conversation over dinner before. We have few options, and you're more optimistic than I am about the capacity of fiscal policy to actually play a role, especially given the partisanship and polarization. Both of you.
Well, yeah, I'm completely in agreement with Martin. I think that central banking is basically played out. I think it's funny to hear Trump attacking the Fed and saying, please do this, do that, when I think in the end there's not much they can do that will make much difference. Japan has had 3 recessions in the last 10 years. Not one of them did Japanese monetary policy play a role in. They were basically sitting there and being buffeted by external events. Europe is right now closer to recession than the United States, in spite of the fact that they have had negative rates, and they are now more deeply negative. The United States, I think Larry likes to say, is one recession away from being in the exact same predicament. Every central banker says now's the time for fiscal policy. I'm sorry, but I mean, since I'd like a pony, okay? In fact, I'd like it to be a pink one. but nobody's giving out ponies.
Right.
So let's have a different discussion, okay? We have seen that Germany, the only country that really has a lot of fiscal space, refuses to use it. In the United States, we had the largest fiscal expansion in peacetime history while the economy was booming. Okay, I think that speaks to the inability of our political system to actually do countercyclical fiscal policy. So we're basically looking at a world where there will be no monetary policy and no fiscal policy. And that is a world that actually kind of, I've been working on this as a theme. It kind of looks like the 1800s, okay? In the 1800s, the United States did not have a central bank, but we still had business cycles. Britain had a central bank, but it didn't actually preoccupy itself with business cycles. It was basically there to like backstop the banking system. And that's what we will have in the future. We will be like Japan. We will have business cycles, but they will result from sort of spontaneous eruptions of animal spirits, credit booms and credit busts, global shocks and so forth. But the technocrats that, and when I got into this business, probably when you did too, the only working rule on Wall Street was don't fight the Fed, because what the Fed did basically drove markets and the economy. That won't be true, and I think that's kind of a phase shift, a regime shift that people haven't really taken on board.
And Darren, I ask you the same question, but a twist. Should we be defending the Fed? Should we be out there, me, you, all of us, should we be out there defending this institution that is now under assault? The president is setting them up for failure beyond their control. Are we doing enough to protect institutions generally in this particular institution?
Well, just to the previous point, I think, it's pretty telling when Mario Draghi and Christine Lagarde are out there begging for fiscal policy. They're basically saying you need to, before Lagarde went over, but you need to basically do more on the fiscal side because central banks can't do more. And to your point on the Fed, I mean, Greg and I were talking about this, and Martin, I guess there has been a history of presidents beating up on the Fed, though the mechanism by which Trump does it now is quite different through Twitter. I don't know that what he's doing is helping because it actually puts the Fed in a really, really tough spot. They will seem like they're caving if they do what he wants. But to Martin's point, they couldn't get above 2.5 in part because of the trade war. I mean, the president has, not just the trade war, but just the instability and the uncertainty that is happening both with Brexit and the trade policy. So, I think I don't think that the Fed is, all powerful anymore. And I think that the institution matters, and I think that what is happening to it in terms of being, called boneheads and, bad golfers, I mean, it's amusing. I think more people care about the Fed now than at any time in, recent history. I think it's made, my job incredibly interesting. I can't remember the last time that we would get that many Fed stories on the front page of the New York Times. But I think that it does, destabilize the institution, and I think it makes it hard for them to make the right calls for the right reasons without being castigated politically for what they're doing.
Martin, you've got a piece that said, stop, I have the title right here. We are playing with a fire in a wooden home. Are we expecting the Fed to play the fire department for the fire that we're setting ourselves, and they can't do it?
Actually, what I was going to comment on what was just said was actually on those lines. I mean, I made 2 points. The basic point in there, which I think very much underlines consistent with what Deborah just said, which is it would really help if policymakers stopped doing really stupid things. And we started off with a discussion of them. I mean, haven't changed mine. I regard the trade wars that the US has started I could wax lyrical on this for about half an hour, as on every possible direction in terms of conception, execution, context in the global regime, as just unbelievably stupid and damaging. So that clearly is one of the reasons we're in this situation. And if people stop doing stupid things, we might avoid what seems to me not a necessary recession. There's nothing in the world economy that's triggering this. This is, I think, in very significant measure. There are other elements, but in very significant measure due to colossal unforced errors. And if that goes on, who the hell knows where we're going to? The second point, I think Greg makes a very interesting point. I think you meant the 1900s, not the 1800s, but we can discuss macroeconomic policy in the
19th century.
Okay, 18 in the, well, anyway, the 1800s to the 1900s, the last 2 centuries. This seems to me a fundamental point, because it perhaps the most important about the future of our societies. When we had no macro policy, first, the scale of the financial sector and its capacity to collapse was relatively small, really relatively small. So the business cycles created by financial instability throughout the 19th century were relatively modest compared to what we've seen in the capacity in the 20th century. But the more important point, we now have universal suffrage democracy, which we didn't have, and expectations of government associated with that. If we move into a world where we have large and significant business shocks, financial crises, whatever it may be, and there'll be a lot of those given the debt levels, which lead to very large swings in output, perhaps even comparable to the sort of thing we saw in 2009, and governments respond by saying, sorry, chums, we can't do anything about this. We're played out. Those governments will not last. The people will not let that happen. And I think the system will change. I don't want to make these comparisons, Goodwin's law and all the rest of it, but what made Hitler get into power? Because the existing forces in Germany in the beginning of the 30s basically said, Chancellor Brüning, we can't do anything about this. We got 25% unemployment, but we can't do anything about this. And then they elected somebody who said, I can do something about it. By the way, he was right. So completely he was completely right. He could do something about the macroeconomics. He did a few other things. The big point is, if politicians now say, central banks can't help, we can't help, we are out of any possibility of dealing what is making you so miserable, they'll get rid of them and they will replace them with somebody else. And you won't like the somebody else's. It will make Mr. Trump look a very modest, mild, conservative person. And I'm being absolutely serious on that, because in many ways, as has been pointed out, Mr. Trump is a very conservative figure in economic policy, but he's not the last word on populism.
We had Ray Dalio here yesterday, and he made that very point, this very sobering point. Greg?
So I was just going to make the point that central banks aren't completely like powerless. They still have their ability to be lenders of last resort, which was the original reason we got central banks. Jay Powell likes to point out that there's no divine coincidence that says that that the same interest rate that gives you price stability also gives you financial stability. And for that reason, we had the last two, arguably three recessions, early 90s, early 2000s, 2007, 2008, were not primarily driven by tight monetary policy. They were driven by modestly tighter monetary policy, coupled with a boom and then a bust in asset prices. So in 2007, 2008 was a bust in asset prices that then developed into a systemic crisis in our financial system. If that sequence of events were to happen again, our central banks still have ample means to go out there and reliquify banks to basically, purchase good collateral at a discount, charged at a penalty rate, the rule that they always did. They still have the ability to significantly cut off those left tails of very bad crisis events. I think what Ray Dalio has an interesting way of putting this. He says he doesn't see a likely sharp collapse, but he sees a sag, because what central banks lack is the ability to use the traditional, we're going to stimulate interest-sensitive spending to get growth above potential and unemployment down, that creates a kind of broadly shared improvement in real incomes, which addresses a sort of anger, I suppose, that Martin is worried about. So we're entering a world where central banks have the ability to, I think, cut off some of the worst case scenarios, but not to achieve the broadly shared rising real incomes that I think most of us believe would be the best antidote to the political anxiety going on right now.
Unfortunately, we're running out of time. We didn't get to technology. We didn't get to a whole host of issues. And I really want to spend some time on possible good news. I think oftentimes we talk ourselves into such a pessimistic outlook, and it's too early in the morning to begin that. But ladies and gentlemen, thank you for spending time with my friends and myself here on the stage this morning, going over the headlines. Please give them a round of applause.